This question is focusing on what happens when you decrease an amount a certain percent and then increase that new amount the same percent. Does it get back to what you originally had, or do things change? And so for this type of problem, I find it helpful to have a little diagram to sort of visualize the percents. So I've already made this diagram to sort of help us get started. So we know that you're making 60,000 a year. So if you're thinking about this sort of this whole thing is our 100% to start, which was $60,000 in a year. And unfortunately, after the first month on the job, your company finds out they need to cut salaries and is giving you a 10% pay decrease. And so what I did is I took that 100% and I split it into 10 parts. So then if I'm thinking about each piece sort of individually, this piece right here, that would be 10%. And that's how much we're decreasing. And so there's two different ways we can think of this. We can think of this as a 10% decrease of 60,000, or I could think about what I'm keeping, the rest of the salary that is staying on. And so let's actually focus, let's first start with that 10% decrease. And so I can say, okay, well, I'm losing 10% of my salary. How much money am I losing? So remember with percents, we can say, okay, that's 10 out of 100. And I'm losing 10% of 60,000, which would be $6,000. So that's the amount, that's the pay decrease. But that's not my new salary, which is what I'm being asked for. So then I have to do some subtraction. I have to say, well, I started at 60,000, and I'm going to subtract out that 6,000 that I'm losing. And so now my annual salary is $54,000. So that's the new annual salary. And that's totally acceptable. That way works. If you're like, I'm good, then skip ahead to the next part of the problem. If you're like, that doesn't make sense to me, let's talk about the other way to face this problem. The other way is to focus on what stays. And so if you think about it, all of this is remaining. Well, if 10% is leaving, what percentage of the salary are we keeping? Well, a quick little math of 100 minus 10% would be 90%. So we're keeping 90% of our salary. So the other way to face this would be, okay, we did the 100 minus 10. So I want 90% of 60,000, which guess what? Would get us that 54,000 annual salary. All right, so we have that pay decrease. A year later, the company decides to give us a 10% raise. And so the question is, am I back to $60,000 a year? Why or why not? And so what you'll notice I've already done here is I've created a little grid, but this grid is smaller than the original one. In fact, it lines up with that sort of 90% amount because we're not starting at the same 100%. We're starting at 90, we're starting at that 54,000. So in this case, this 100% is the 54,000. And so you're like, I'm going to add on a 10%, but it's not 10% of the original amount. It's 10%. It's a 10% that matches this particular function. And so the reality here is we're now adding on, and I'm going to just add it on here. We now have an extra 10%. And so that's what this little piece is. This is our sort of plus 10%, but it's plus 10% of that 54,000. So the question is how much is that little green square I drew? How much is that 10,000, that 10% of 54,000? So I'm going to do 10% of 54,000. And so, 10 over 100, do my multiplication, and I find out that I would be getting an extra $5,400. So that's my pay raise. Notice that my pay raise is not the same thing as my pay decrease. I'm gaining $600 less than I lost. So I'm not getting back to the same amount. And in fact, I can then add that 54,000, so 5,400, sorry, to my 54,000. And I find that my new salary is $59,400. So it's $600 less. And so we're making $600 less. And so we can compare this value and this value, and we see that the 6,000 minus the 5,400, we are earning $600 less than we originally made. And that's partly due to that 10%. The original was 10% of 60,000, while in the pay raise, it was 10% of 54,000. So be careful when people tell you that, the market went down 5% and then it went back up 5% the next day, because those are not the same numerical values. Hopefully this sort of helps you visualize and think about percents of a percent, and how we need to tread very carefully when dealing with percentages.